From the very morning, we take a look at the bold titles of newspapers, surfing our Twitter account, or checking out our Instagram for the recent happenings, listening to the latest news. We are dealing with Vitrine if we take Vitrine as a kind of information management or a means to represent reality in a manipulated way. Also, in our urban experience, our facades are covered by some illuminated surfaces that are representing something in different ways. We really get used to it because it's entwined with our public life. Vitrine is basically a French word that refers to any glassy showcase. A very interesting thing about this word is that it's used and pronounced almost the same in very different languages, like English, Dutch, Persian, Arabic, German, and so on. But the inseparable notion from this word is that the material of glass and the character of being showcased. If you assume a public area, architects differentiate the space by creating an enclosure. We make borders by several architectural elements like wall, windows, doors, and so on. But one of these elements is vitrine, and it is a window which is opening to the public and it aims to introduce or represent the inside to the public. Therefore, it differs from window as window's target is inside, but vitrine's goal is outside and public. We can always see it all over the world, mostly in commercial spaces, in the shop windows. But an exciting thing in Northern Europe is that we always see a similar example of it also in a private house where there is a kind of manipulation involved in the foreground and with the people living in the background. Also, the way we present ourselves in public is different from private. And perhaps that's the kind of vitrine we create for ourselves in a very early stage. This shows itself sometimes in our body language, sometimes in our clothes, and sometimes even in our silence. As you saw, I used different words to describe the function of vitrine. At the first stage, I think it's essential to know what kind of word should be used for this function: attract, seduce, introduce, or delight. And then, how the inside reality should be represented. Where should the vitrine stand in the balance between being truthful to the inside and being attractive to the public? And as it's related to the public and it is currently constituting the whole facades of the most important walking areas in most of the cities, how understanding of this crucial border would affect our public life and our urban experience. Talking about shop windows cannot be seen separately from the trade itself. As soon as trade became part of human life, a kind of trade interface, a trade front was inevitable, whether with a glass window or not. Bazaar and their equivalents in Western Europe and North America, as street markets, are historically some trade-based spaces where goods and services were exchanged or sold. They were mainly targeting the routine and basic needs of people. It was not sooner than the early 17th century when the first examples of shop appeared. The trade activity started to be enclosed within the walls of shop. But the primitive examples are mostly open in front. There was a window, but it could be open for the face-to-face interaction. A very critical analysis of the life and its difference in public and private was given by Richard Sennett in the book Fall of the Public Man. He believes that in 18th century Paris and London was the first period in which life in private and public was distinctively different. In public, appearances were so manipulated to be more precise indicators of their social standing. Laborers were easily identified by their social clothes. Middle ranks of society, or like baristas and accountants and merchants, also wore actually distinctive decorations, wigs or ribbons. He believed that public man of the 18th century was an actor. Therefore, although clothes were coded in relation to social ranks and profession, it was not so strict for people to use correct order. It was not important who you are as long as you try to be someone. Also, reading about the shop vitrines in the 18th century exhibit that they mainly used three essential items. First was the general presence of the small paned windows. The second was hanging sign that was enormous in size and hanging closely together. The third one was bow window, a favorite device in the second half of the 18th century for making the display more conspicuous, but also for getting more light into the shop. Another type of shop vitrine that was developed in that period was a kind of fancy style that was ungoverned by architectural logic, but designed to show a profusion of objects in separate windows. Also, a kind of imitation attitude started to develop, and some materials like compo appeared to imitate the high-class original carvings. The interest to show the social ranking in the vitrine was also so much the same as what was about people's clothing. Alan Powers says, those who have the good fortune to serve any branch of the royal family immediately place a large sculpture of their several arms and supporters over their doors and their own names and business in golden character. It is so much close to what the women of the time wore as a special elaborated wig. Sennett believes that the shape of the head was totally obscured. It was support for the real focus of interest, the wig or hairdo. Also, in terms of its interior, studies show that a kind of theatrical effect was present in the shop. Shops were deep and were divided in two parts. A lot of shops had a sort of back shop, and Rocket comments in 1755 about the interior space of the shop and say that these shops, they make as deep as possibly they could. The further end was generally lightened from above, and a kind of illumination which joined to the glasses and the scones of the rest of the furniture in regard to those passing by was frequently productive of a kind of theatrical effect. What happened in the 19th century, which changed the definition and the function of public and private life, were actually two massive changes. First was the Industrial Revolution and proliferation of goods and services, and the second was the secularization of the society. Both contribute to emerging the concept of personality in public and private life. What secularization did was to distract the masses from the belief in religion and God. However, a need for a replicant, for an actor-like belief was still there. So the public mass needs something to grasp, and the new culture had something to present, personality. Based on personality, people were disposed to make more and more of differences in the immediate impressions they made upon each other. The personality of the 19th century varies among people and is related to the appearances that have no distance from impulse. They expresses actually the inner self in a direct way. The effect of personality in the public realm was that a kind of mystification of appearances has accordingly occurred. The mystification of appearances was a reflection against being easily discoverable by others, and it occurred at the same time in the world of commerce and industry as well. Following the Industrial Revolution and after the introduction of the plate glass, also some noticeable change happened on the shop scales. The stall boards at the base of the windows virtually eliminated. Shop fronts carried much higher up, the central doors set back profoundly to allow the display windows carvings inward. At the same time, the arched top of shops started to be flattened, especially in new designs, and the effects of all these changes were the great increase in similarity of the fronts. In many cases, as Henry Russell Hitchcock points out, the similarity and uniformity of certain shops' fronts of this period with the decoration of stamped and embossed book jackets. Likewise, in the realm of people representation in public, the most insipid decade in the history of feminine dress began in 1840, a tedious mediocrity characterized an entirely middle-class era. In 1850, first department store, namely Bon Marché, opened in Paris, and exactly like what happened in the public life, in terms of mystification of appearances, which are told about it, happened in the shop vitrines. This time, the commodity started to be mystified. Uh, Bon Marché introduced the fixed price system, and it turned the passivity to a norm. In the 18th and the early 19th century, entering a store was equal to buying something, and it involved a dramatic effort to convince the buyer. Bon Marché's new system of low markup, high volume was starting to leave no time for such theatrical behavior. They needed more substantial speed of selling as a result of machine-made goods. To persuade or to stimulate the buyers to go for these objects and goods, they decided to create a spectacle out of the store to endow the products with an interest the merchandise intrinsically lacked. Rather than 100 pots on the floor, they started to put only one sample in the vitrine with another example of a different shape beside it. What happened in the impact of this vitrine was that the use value of the goods turned to be suspended, and people started to buy it not because they needed it, but because it was unexpectedly strange. They started the process out accustoming the buyer to a type of unexpectedness in the store, to be surprised by a strange piece. This way, the high volume started to work through the act of disorientation. They also created a delusion of scarcity in supply, and that this special one is the last one in its type. In department stores, buyers of goods learned new roles for themselves, apprehended themselves as consumers, something different from mere users of products. The store itself conveyed that difference, taught in the physical and spatial features it developed. Neoclassical fronts, ornamental doorways, large window displays, and inside often a rotunda with upper floor visible as galleries. The relation between department store building and the people of time is very well exhibited in the work of Joseph Hornecher in 1908 and Alex West in 1928. The perspective of this department store strikes with the impression of grandeur imposed by the commercial building. The department stores are spread over 3 levels and extended widely in the city. Compared to passerby, their windows appear immense. The building is very sophisticated, multiple entrance, balustrades, roof terraces, with ornament characteristic of Art Nouveau. This new style is in sharp contrast to the often well-decorated but sober and severe works of the previous era. At the same time, as the new way of buying, Alex shows the effect. Fur coat, bell hat, and high heels make up a uniformity. The painter synthesizes the whole process of industrialization of fashion. It makes the idea of uniformization sensitive to beyond the very existence of the department store. The tendency toward further simplification was ongoing up to 1950s and 60s, both in the shops and human. With the shop vitrine reduced to a neutral frame, attention was concentrated on the whole interior. And the same approach has taken place in the realm of clothing. Sennett calls 1960s as the age of see-through blouses, hip hugger pants, and the like. The body was turning to be wholly expressional, and shop was starting to be entire vitrine, and borders were gradually fading out. In terms of urban experience, something new happened in arcade, as it was an enclosure that largely influenced the city dweller. It is important also because it contributed to later development of the cities with regard to the concept of vitrine. Arcades owe their prosperity but also their decline to the technological development of 19th century. Arcade was indeed a development. The reason for such praise was the elegant solution it provided to a frightful problem in the mid-19th century. Streets were metalled, town centers became more sophisticated, but arcades remained an acceptable means of providing high-density, small shops. The shopping arcade took the form of a covered passageway with shops on one or both sides. Above it were either skylight or a fully glazed roof. It was developed as an independent unit, becoming an inward-looking street with external facades both to its entrance buildings and to its shops. And it in turn has influenced builders of the large modern 20th century multi-use shopping centers which have pedestrian corridors running through them. There was a significant similarity between the early Parisian and London examples and the Greek Stoa. For example, in Attalus' Stoa in Athena, double colonnades on 2 stories provided shaded walkway in front of 42 shops that were rented out by the city. The development of the arcades merely attached the second side of shops and a glass and iron roof, creating an enclosure which contained formal repetitive sides with standard bays divided by orders. Individuality for retailers was obtained only by window displays and signboards in sharp contrast to the traditional shopping streets. In the late 18th century that we can track the first arcades in Paris. From that city the idea was carried throughout Europe and America, and later it was taken around the world. The majority of arcades were built after 1860, during a period of city expansion and modernization. At its peak, there were around 300 arcades built, from which now only 30 has left. Some arcades consist of purely functional retail units with little or no architectural merit. Still, conversely, there are many which are magnificent buildings. There is the shopping arcade, which is a covered street either deliberately planned as a new street or built over an existing alley, but a street linking 2 other streets and forming an essential part of the communication network of a town. The distribution of arcades in the Paris urban context shows how they are connecting the different streets and create a layer of interiority within the city. Also, a layout diagram of the covered passage shows how they gradually developed some different typologies from the straightforward type. In Panorama's passage, which is one of the oldest in Paris, we can see how it evolved in a way to enhance the commercial space. It is 320 meters long and only 3.2 meters wide.
Wer 1817 die Passage des Panoramas betrat, dem sangen auf der einen Seite die Sirenen des Gaslichts und gegenüber lockten als Ölflammen Odalisken.
En s'allumant brusquement, les lumières électriques firent pâlir l'éclat irréprochable de ces galeries, qui devenaient soudain plus difficiles à trouver, qui pratiquaient une magie noire avec les portes et contemplaient leur intérieur par des fenêtres aveugles.
Das war kein Niedergang, sondern der Umschlag. Mit einem Schlage waren sie die Hohlform, aus der das Bild der Moderne gegossen wurde. Hier spiegelte mit Suffisanz das Jahrhundert seine allerneueste Vergangenheit. Hier war das Altersheim der Wunderkinder.
As mentioned, the second half of the 19th century was an extraordinary moment to live, due to massive change in social and political and economic structures. Walter Benjamin was a perfect observer of the time, who beside all above was living in the middle of 2 world wars and lived the last 13 years of his life roaming in Parisian arcades, and worked on his eventually unfinished masterpiece, Das Passagenwerk. The arcade project is a long collage-like quote of text to explain some of the most complicated issues of city life in modern Paris. and it includes 30 convolutes as Benjamin named it, and perhaps it meant to be finished, interpret and represent by the later thinkers.
Benjamin visited the arcades in their decline. The arcades addresses in a lengthy allegorical form the dream and the confidence of Western man for progress so far, but it also exposes the reality of the capital if one contemplates. Benjamin saw a dialectic of promise and failure of modern capitalism in the arcade. This ambivalence is best concluded in the term suggested by his commentator Adorno as a dialectic image between capital oppression by the idea of consumption and liberation, with pointing out the utopia of plenty. It is a means to show how architecture is transformed by economic forces rather than desire. Benjamin saw the arcades both the dream and the reality of capitalism consumption. It was a dream because it was finally a beautiful product and an achievement. It was an enclosed public space, well lighted, aesthetically pleasing, protection against bad weather and noise, and at their best, a utopia of plenty. It was a new form of being mostly targeting desire than necessity. But at the same time, with all its vitrine, it was a distortion of reality, its mystification to a further level, and in this regard, it was the reality of its loss. Also, it was an exotic new place for the flaneur, a city stroller which is less interested in buying but more interested in observing the city. On a leisurely walk, he can roam around the arcade, watch the people, the vitrines, the architecture, and feel delighted. One sign of this pleasure, which is a sign of a clash with the pace of modernity, is the image of flaneur walking with a pet turtle in leashes. A quality of walking through all the materials of fast machine-made industrial products without being concerned about having to choose something to purchase, a leisure walk combined with contemplation. As a reflection of the rhythm of this new modern life, Benjamin saw this arcade surrounded vertical displays of shopping as a kind of pre-cinema. It was built in fact in a cinematic model. The nature of arcades imposed the shoppers to limit their shop with the flat surface of the window and vertical stacking of goods in a proper height to let the full pleasure achieved by the flaneur. It was in contrast with the express shops, which were not always that limited in displaying their goods. They still were able to use the street as a device to attract the pedestrian. However, in the arcade, the visual image of vitrine took the most prominent role, just the same as what cinema did with theater. In this enclosed public space of arcade, a space itself turned to be a kind of vitrine. Merchants kept devising new ways to attract the attention of a buyer with both literal and seminal means, and with creating multiple visual intersections. This was a significant hint to recall how our contemporary world tends to be promotional. The compactness that was in the arcade finds its way to even further stage in the shopping malls and nowadays in the virtual window shopping, where this linear arrangement of vitrine turns to only one glass vitrine of our phones with lots of tabs open. Availability grew more, the power of selection grew more, but also the distance between buyer and seller. The virtual flaneur is more of a selector, a legend of passivity with the fantasy of strength. Slowly, the pleasure of selecting becomes supplanted by a sense of being part of a machine. However, among waves of despair, it is again Benjamin who left us something to grab to get out of the situation. The optical unconscious is a concept which I found useful when an architect or artist is supposed to work on critical areas such as vitrine. Benjamin believed that the situation of consciousness need only to be transferred from the individual to the collective, and the task of the intellectual correspondingly moves from the interior of the bourgeois individual subject to the aggregated subject of mass culture. The arcade of shopkeepers becomes the perceptual consciousness, the sensing unit of the vast cultural body. Their transparent glazed window becomes sensible membranes, eyeballs and eardrums
that register the signals of capital and render them to us for decoding, for interpretation, for action. It is crucial that technology to be involved, but it needn't to be fancy. All it has to do is to take us from the overlooked noise of everyday to that space informed by the unconscious, that other nature that speaks to the camera rather than I. Then and there we might find it, the tiny something that bursts into the collective. This is exactly what artists like Marcel Duchamp did with their rotorelief in 1935, intentionally erotic, the disc undulations from convex and then concave apparition thrusting out at us or sucking us in. Their mechanically pulsating patterns continue to demonstrate that the electromagnetic sense of sight, so convinced of their mastery of the universe, can be undone by the viscera claiming its own response. Duchamp filmed the rotorelief to make it more collectively spread out, but do we really altered by these films? In their own times, no one knew what to do with these rotorelief or ideas of Benjamin's theory. However, as Persian and fragmentary of a convolute, Duchamp's object now seem perfect for triggering theories of embodied cognition and the working of experiential art and architecture. Architecture primarily defines space by separating one area from another, and the requirements of this is creating differentiation between inside and outside. The inside and outside could not exist without each other. This essential relationship served by a border, which defined by elements like walls, opening, and visual accesses. The critical case of Vitrine is that beside this inherent quality as a border, especially when it comes to commercial spaces, it necessarily involves a kind of manipulation that represents the inside and what it contains concerning the political, social, and even economic trends of the time. Vitrine's architectural shape, in relation with trade transformation, has evolved from a saturated interface between people in the market and earlier shops to a simplified linear visual image. The overall concept of representation of goods had changed a little after Industrial Revolution, though the common spaces containing it has drastically changed over the years. Personality, custom mystification of appearances, and plate glass contribute to the mystification of commodity. The purification and simplification in the appearance of shops had increased, and the playfulness and social activity of shopping had been lost in many cases. We still see more often in city centers, famous brands with their vast illuminated fronts are representing all kinds of low-quality materials with the big red sign stating sale and a percentage in a bold font. Vitrines still have the leading role in the mystifying process. In other words, the social activity of shopping has turned to a propagandistic representation at one side and the passive observer or seduced urban stroller on the other hand. At the other side of the story, as a person takes some steps away from the very commercial and touristic centers of the town to some adjacent neighborhoods, he will come across some shop fronts that are less manipulated in falsified seduction. They represent borders whose political weight had reduced in favor of social life. They contain an underlying complexities of life and livelihood on the subwords inside, while expressing some tactical expressions of combining goods and service and culture and ethnicity in the outside. Finally, considering the inevitability of the propagandistic and visual presence of vitrine in our urban experience, optical consciousness can be used as a tool even in architecture to let people be collectively equipped The eye is not always right, and this can be shown in architecture to encourage people to cross the boundary and to explore the space rather than being an amazed observer. Our vitrines are doing all the magic to entertain people, to attract or to seduce them, and reversely it is getting more and more boring for all walks of life. With a look to the Benjamin's theory of progress, may it be possible to exhibit some meaningful movies in the public? May it be possible that in addition to commercial vitrines, vitrines also frame ordinary lives of people and bring it into the street? Is there any pleasure for public to look at itself with all its primary and less manipulated experience?